Dr. Miriam Shadis, who is Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, and why do people call him the Cid?
Well, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar was a Castilian nobleman. He was from a well-to-do, powerful family closely associated with the court of the King of Castilla and Leon, which was a Christian kingdom in the northern part of Spain. And he was a warrior, right? He led troops for this king, and as such, he was pretty successful. He had a lot of adventures in the southern part of Spain, fighting against Muslims and also allying with them. He was somewhat of a mercenary, and so he would go to the highest, the best paid, job around. And he had a lot of trouble with the king of Castilla and Leon. This king was called Alfonso, and he and Alfonso had a lot of just conflict. And so regularly, Rodrigo would take off, and he would be banished from court, and he would take his troops with him and go off and ally with some, Muslim ruler, or go out and strike out on his own and try to win some territory. So he was really a very kind of very successful version of a typical warrior nobleman hero type in the 12th century, which is when he lived. And he's called El Cid kind of for complicated reasons. The name comes from the Arabic for Sayyid or Sidi, and this just means my lord or the Lord, or I tell my students sometimes boss, the guy in charge. But he wasn't called that in his lifetime. In his lifetime, he was called El Campiodor, or the Latin would be Campus Doctor, right? He was the leader of the battlefield and the champion. And later, and we can talk about this in a minute maybe, but later there's a great poem, an epic poem written about him, and it's at that point that the poet gives him the name El Cid, and it kind of sticks. An interesting thing is that the name Cid or Sidi was pretty common among elites in Iberia, and you see a lot of you see it showing up regularly, but it's never associated with him in his lifetime.
Well, of all the medieval Spanish figures that existed, why do you think he gets not just a movie made about him, but also a recent TV show, a giant statue, and even you shared with me a former prime minister who liked to dress up like the Cid?
Right. Well, I think I told you earlier, he had good press, right? So in his lifetime, there were, in his lifetime, he participated in society, and he issued documents, right? He bought and sold things, and his name appears on documents, and he was present at the court at different times when he was in with the king. And so we have his, we can sort of see where he was and how he was operating. At one point, he becomes the ruler of his own kingdom, Valencia. We can look at that in a minute on a map, but he's leaving documentation. About 50 years after he dies, somebody anonymously wrote a Latin chronicle history of him, and it's called the Historia Rodriki, the history of Rodrigo. And this was maybe written by someone who knew him, possibly paid for by his wife, maybe, some people think. But it lays out basically his narrative, right, his story. And then another 50 to 75 years after that, all right, at the very end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th century, some anonymous poet wrote this great epic poem, okay, the Poema del mio Cid, or the Cantar de mio Cid. It's the song of my Lord, the song of my Cid. And this person, it's like fan fiction, right? This person took this story, took this hero, and created a narrative that was really, has a lot about it that's super cool and interesting. It's the first piece of, I think it's the very first piece of extensive poetry anyway, written in Castilian, right? So in the vernacular, not in Latin. And it really tells the story of a conflict between a good vassal, a good lord, and a bad king or a weak king. And it has a lot of drama in there as El Cid is always proving his loyalty. And he's always, if you want to go back to that, well, later we can look at it again, that picture, he's always swearing by his beard in this poem. He's like, by my beard, I will, prove myself and whatever. So here you have him with this enormous beard. It must weigh 40 pounds hanging off his face. So he's got this piece of fan fiction, really, right? And it's important culturally to historians of Spain and to the historians of the Spanish language. And it lays out a narrative that's very clear in terms of good and bad, right? Black and white. And it tends to, so the Cid, fought a lot against Muslims, for sure. He also, as I said, he allied with them. And so it tends to erase that a little bit, and it just makes him into this pure Christian hero, which is then how he is promoted for the centuries that follow. Okay. So when you have those politicians dressing up like him, or the fascist leader of Spain, Francisco Franco was the one who had that statue put up in Burgos, which is where El Cid is from. So Burgos is there on the map. If you look at the center north, right there, so an old capital city. Okay, and Rodrigo's family was from nearby there. So yeah, that particular statue is there in front of the cathedral, it was put up as a monument to some idea about Christian Spain. Later in the 1980s, the president of Castilla y León, which is one of the larger states of Spain, right? And Spain, remember, doesn't exist in the Middle Ages, but there's these different kingdoms and different countries. Anyway, the president, Jose Maria Aznar, who would eventually become the prime minister of Spain, did a kind of a photo shoot. He was asked, what are you passionate about? Let's take a picture. And he did this photo shoot for this magazine where he dressed up like El Cid, and he got up on top of a castle and had the wind blowing and all this kind of stuff. So here he is. This comes up again and again and again when they talk about this guy who is a very conservative politician, and again, interested in promoting a kind of an idea of a unified, pure Christian Spain, which would not be historical, but is an idea that the poem kind of presents. Yeah.
One of the things that struck me even as an undergraduate when I read this poem, and every time I reread it or watching the movie, is how it isn't just a Christian versus Muslim poem, and the movie, I think, does a good job of that. I don't know, but that it seems like there's a lot of other motives going on besides religion or ethnic differences. Is that true, or am I misreading?
No, I think it could be true for sure. I mean, a big text part of the poem story is the conflict between the Cid and the Infantes De Carrion. I don't think Carrion is on this map, but it would be up there between Burgos and Leon, I think. It's a principality. And these guys are noblemen. They're close to the king at court, and they're jealous of the Cid and the favoritism that the king seems to show him. And they're determined to have their, to be respected. And I can't remember what happens, but there's a moment in the poem where the Cid embarrasses them, or they fail, they do something lame, and he's like, well, he mocks them. And so they really have it in for him. So they devise this elaborate scheme where they marry his daughters, and then they abuse the women terribly, right? It's a really gruesome situation. And they don't get away with it, and the Cid is able to bring them to court, but he's always containing his rage and his anger, and he's always going to just defer to the power of the king. And I think that the message of the person who wrote the poem in the 12th or the late 12th century when they wrote it, was really something about what a good king should be like, right? And unfortunately, the Cid doesn't have a good king, and that's a refrain in the poem. Apart from swearing from his beard by his beard all the time, the poet's always saying, "Oh, what a great noble! If only he had a great lord! If only he had a great lord!" So it's a time in Castilian history when there's a lot of pressure on the kings to be a certain way, and the poem reflects that, right? And it reflects the kind of jealousies that might happen between various noblemen as they vie for the king's attention. There's a subplot in the poem as well where the Cid tricks some Jews who are men who live in Burgos, and he tricks them into lending him lots of money so he can go fund his war campaign, and he gives them a treasure as a security for the gold that they give him. And the treasure turns out to be a box of sand, and everybody thinks this is hilarious, right? Because they're just Jews. So, there's that little piece in the story. Yeah, there's probably some other things I'm not thinking of at the moment, but that's a big part of the story. Yeah.
Well, one of the things you said that I noticed was how the Cid is, even though he's obviously a hero, he also spends a lot of the poem being an outlaw and even an exile. And he's going around to these different places, making alliances sometimes with Christians, often with Muslims. And why does Spain look like that? I mean, that's a big question. But this map that you shared with me is better than my map because it uses color and shows all of these different sort of big but also tiny kingdoms, and all the ones in color are all Muslim kingdoms. Right. And he seems to move back and forth between these worlds. So
move around in there easily. So I'll just say a couple of things. One is that if you can imagine this map as being just two colors, right? The northern kingdoms are the ones that are all gray, and then the color part really represents a powerful kingdom that lasted from around 750 to around 1030. Okay, so for several hundred years, there was a caliphate there, the Caliphate of Cordoba. And you see Cordoba there in the center, a little green region. And that great kingdom broke up, right? And what you see here is the result of the breakup. And these little entities are called taifas. And that means, it's Arabic, it means party or faction. And so what's going on that this map doesn't show, but that the Cid participated in, is the reorganization of all these political identities. So you're going to end up with about 5 really big ones: Badajoz, Toledo, Zaragoza, Sevilla, and I think that's, and maybe in Cordoba as well, right? And so the little ones are going to get gobbled up by the big ones. And the Cid's region is Valencia. There's the purple part there on the by the Mediterranean, and he goes down there and he takes this very wealthy, very beautiful city, and he rules it like a king for about 5 years until he dies, right? So, but he's participating in that reorganization in that way. The other thing I'll say is that even when he worked for the king of Leon, he often went south, and he often went to Sevilla and Carmona and down there, because the Muslim kings regularly allied with the Christian kings, and they used each other against each other. The ruler of Sevilla sent his daughter up to be a concubine and eventually wife of the Christian king of Leon, of Cid's boss. So these people are really moving around all the time. They're very flexible in some ways, right? They're very adaptable. And I'm sure somebody must have studied this, but I think for certain this, and Rodrigo, he spoke Arabic, right? He must have been able to communicate. And he certainly was very familiar with the various cultures and regions of the entire peninsula. And he wasn't the only one who was like that, right? It was much more normal for individuals to have these experiences.
Well, that wasn't a very fair question to ask you to explain the 300 years of history. Here's an easier question. How much do you love the movie The Cid from 1961?
Yeah, I don't love it as much as some people love it, but that's probably because I'm not as familiar with it. I have watched it, and I know that it is a cinematographic masterpiece. You know, I have bad feelings about Charlton Heston. And I'm generally not like this. I generally don't sit around going like, well, that's not accurate and that's not accurate. But there are things about that movie that I just find to be too mind-bogglingly strange. I don't know if everybody's watched it, so I don't want to give away what happens. But the end is just
awesome,
and phenomenally weird. And there's Jimena, the Cid's wife, up there on the battlements of the castle. The Muslims are all dressed up like Turkish people, with their Turkish helmets from the 18th century or something. I mean, it's just it's very strange. But you've inspired me to go back and watch it. So.
Well, tell me just a little bit about Jimena, and because you did talk with me in a separate conversation about kings and queens.
Right.
And Jimena is portrayed by Sophia Loren, and I understand why people might not end up liking Charlton Heston, but I don't know why anyone wouldn't like Sophia Loren. What do you think either about Sophia Loren or more in your expertise zone, Jimena, and either her portrayal in the movie or the poem compared to other depictions of
so right, it's not Sophia Loren's fault, right, that she was badly written. To quote Roger Rabbit. So she's Jimena is, I think, a person that we ought to know more about, right? And I think the right amount of curiosity and digging should reveal some things about her. She was from a noble family, and she and Rodrigo were married when they were relatively young, I think, probably in their early 20s. And they had 3 kids at least who made it to adulthood. And she went with him to Valencia. So they have the 2 little girls that are there in the movie, and I think that's a direct reference to the poem and the 2 daughters in the poem. But Rodrigo and Jimena also had a son who grew to adulthood and was killed in battle somehow, somewhere. Their daughters made very fancy marriages, and one of them married into the royal house of Barcelona, I think, the Counts of Barcelona. So the Cid ends up, or Rodrigo ends up with a descendant who is a royal person. And Jimena is, she goes with him to Valencia. She's there, and when he dies, right, she's really not able to hold the city. And there might be 2 ways to explain that. One is that they were never going to hold the city, right? That it was inevitable that it would be lost to Christian rule. But the other possibility is that, Rodrigo was so successful in part because he was a great leader, and his men really trusted him and followed him everywhere. And that is something that she was not able to make happen. So she leaves the city and she goes back to Castile, and she goes and enters a monastery, I believe, and lives out her days kind of as a dowager, rich lady in a monastery. But her life, I think, in every way, except for the fact that she was married to this kind of spectacular man, was very typical for a noblewoman of her status, and the way it played out. Both getting married, having children, having these opportunities, moving around, traveling, right, and leaving her home and then going back and then ending up in the church, in the monastery there. So.
Okay. Well, my last question is just about the most recent series that started in 2020 of the Cid, which is which is for us is an Amazon series, but it is produced in Spain, I think. And I watched some of it because you told me about it. But could you just what do you think of that? Is it worth our time to go watch it?
I do think it's worth your time. I'll give some caveats, right? There are mistakes and there's frustrating things that happen where, things are depicted in a certain way and there's really no reason for the filmmakers to make those choices. And so if you're a historian, you're like, why are you showing this super clean little city? You didn't need to do that. It's not super clean, things like that. It's the other caveat I would say is that if you can manage to listen in the Spanish, put the English subtitles on and listen in the Spanish, you will appreciate it a lot more, because if you listen to the dubbed version of it, it's terrible. And it's also really not, it's terrible dubbing, and it's just not very good. It doesn't translate well, right? So it's really worth it if you can manage any of the Spanish at all. But what I like about it a lot is that it takes a period of time in Rodrigo's life that we really don't know much about, and at a very interesting court that is in great turmoil over the future. And you have a king, Fernando, and his wife, Queen Sancha, and they have 3 sons and 2 daughters, and they have to decide what's going to happen to their kingdom, who's going to get what. And they live in a time when traditionally things were divided up amongst the various sons. And Rodrigo is a young man at the court. And he starts out like, working as a groom, grooming the horses. And then he makes his way up, and he's super loyal and intense. And the actor that they have playing him is, I think it's a good choice, So it's, the women are depicted very interestingly in the TV series. And so, yeah, I think it's good, and it doesn't, it doesn't try to redo or rethink the Heston film. It's a completely separate story so far. I've watched the first 2 seasons, and I think there will be more, and it only gets up to maybe about the year 1060 or so it's decades before he takes Valencia.
Wow.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, if students are interested in medieval Spain or the Cid or any of this stuff, I imagine there's lots of courses you teach.
Well, there's at least one, yeah. They can come and study Muslims, Christians, and Jews in medieval Spain. For sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.